GOP lawmakers. Fox News can confirm that authorities found a list of 6 names of Republican members of Congress in a van belonging to James Hodgkinson, the left-wing gunman who opened fire at practice for the annual congressional baseball game. The news adds to the mountain of evidence that Hodgkinson specifically targeted Republicans when he went on his shooting spree, wounding 5, including House Majority Whip Steve Scalise, who remains hospitalized and in critical condition. Representative Trent Franks of Arizona was one of the names on Hodgkinson's list. Martha McCallum asked him about it tonight.
There are certainly many indications now that the shooter was premeditated in his actions. I have been notified that there is an investigation and that, yes, that I might be involved in that investigation, but you know, I certainly can't go any further than that.
Can you imagine, Greg, if you get this information and your family members and hearing this and that your name was on a list and here this guy was just opening, you know, like shooting pinballs, guns at people, trying to take as many people down as possible, and you're one of those intended targets?
Yeah, I mean, we just heard about this, some thoughts. Who was not on the list were the cops who killed him. So we have to be reminded that if they weren't there, everybody would have been killed. Yeah. He had a list. He was determined. And so I still believe we should act as if that's the reality, that the cops weren't there, so we remind ourselves what we missed, what could have happened. And when you look at this perpetrator, he flies in the face of the media-approved stereotype. He's an older white man with a gun. He should be a redneck Nazi. He should be a Fox viewer in a red hat that says, "Make America Great Again." But sorry, he's a left-wing MSNBC watcher.
At this hour, too. All right, so Dana, what do you make of this information? It's important that they have security, especially because of the succession in terms of a majority whip position, et cetera. But wow, and they didn't say that Steve Scalise was on the list.
Right, and perhaps, well, I don't know if he is a member of the House Freedom Caucus, because all the members that were on that list were the
Tea
House
Party.
Freedom Caucus, and I don't know if Scalise was a member of that party. So it obviously wasn't random. And so he knew what he was doing, and this idea that he comes to the baseball field and says, are those Republicans or Democrats they're practicing? I would imagine he actually probably knew that, and perhaps we'll find out more. The one thing about security for these members of Congress is very interesting. So only the leadership is actually afforded 24-hour security, because imagine trying to provide 24-hour security for 535 members of Congress. One of the things that members of Congress have been asking, and Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn was talking about this the other day, that they have asked the Federal Election Commission for permission to use some of their campaign funds to supplement security for times when they feel like they might need it, like at a town hall meeting or at some place where they're meeting with constituents, or if they're out in the open where they feel like they need it. And the FEC is sort of, I don't think they haven't said no, but they've sort of been dragging their feet on it. But it seems like, to me, that if it would give some members of Congress some confidence to be able to go out and do their work, that would not be taxpayer-funded dollars. They would have to make a decision to use campaign funds to pay for that. I feel like the FEC should go ahead and approve that, at least in the interim, to give people some confidence, because I'm sure that other members of Congress think they're probably on other lists out there. Hopefully that's not true, but if you don't have any other way of protecting yourself, I think this seems reasonable to me.
I think it's reasonable. I think it's a good idea, and better to be safe than sorry, because certainly there's a fact pattern here, one that warrants perhaps letting them do this and making this accommodation in the interest of legitimate public safety and personal safety for our elected officials.
Well, of course. I mean, you want to have security. The interesting and the difficult situation here is, take the White House. Now you can't even drive down Pennsylvania Avenue. You don't have access. The Capitol is, I mean, that's supposed to be basically a Congress. The American people are supposed to be able to go in there, talk to their elected officials. In recent years, they've made some changes in terms of meeting space by creating that Capitol Visitor Center that so many people may now be familiar with. It's actually underground, but that's where so many of the meetings with constituents take place. And then in the last 2 days since the shooting, Kimberly, you've had meetings between Speaker Ryan and the Minority Leader Pelosi about added investment in security, specifically the Capitol Police, just having more Capitol Police on the grounds and potentially, as Dana was discussing, at some of these town hall meetings. But the question is, how far do you go with security? Because we're an open society and it's a democracy, and you want to be able to speak to your representative.
Yeah, that's the whole point. And a lot of them were making, that exact argument, which I think is an important point. And then you find out that there's lists with people on it, Jesse, and you say, whoa, am I on a list somewhere? That's the problem.
Yeah, I think having a list crystallizes how partisan of an attack this was. There's really no getting around it anymore. It was a partisan political assassination attempt. And this guy watches MSNBC. The guy, was a campaign volunteer for Bernie Sanders. Imagine if it was a Trump volunteer who watched Fox News Channel. Just trying to think of the reaction if it had been the other way, and just trying to highlight some of the hypocrisy. It almost seems like today, the media kind of wants to move on from this story. I was watching a lot of the cable news today. I was reading a lot of the paper, and there's a real appetite to say, you know what? We talked about it. We had the baseball game. Let's move on to Russia.
Yeah.
I don't think that would happen if it was the other way around, and it's not time to move on. I think it's time for some soul searching among everybody, but especially on the left, to say, what are we doing out here? Are we accessories? Are we inciting? These people out there now on social media, if you're not having any boundaries on social media and you're not doing it to someone's face and you're doing it anonymously and there's a million of you and you're trafficking in the same kind of bile, it makes it feel acceptable to slander someone or encourage violence against someone because there's really no barriers there. And then when you get out into the real world and start pulling triggers, that's the problem. There's no division between the reality of real life and stuff on the internet.
There is an argument for the fact that if you create an outlet for that, then you reduce the reality of it happening on the streets.
Perhaps.
If the internet was around in the 80s, in the 70s, would John Lennon be alive because Mark David Chapman would have been harassing him from far away rather than traveling? We don't know that. It's a hypothetical.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to the security question. There was a story today about a Tennessee homeowner who caught those two inmates who killed those prison guards. He held them. He was a citizen with a gun. He held both of these incredibly dangerous murderers on the ground until the police came. He was a Texas homeowner. I'm bringing this up in this story to illustrate that guns save lives. Those guys were on the run. They were on the run. They'd murdered two prison guards. They were going to kill more. A homeowner with a gun prevented the deaths of others, the same way that those police officers, who may not have had to have been there if Scalise wasn't there, saved those lives. So where there is a gun, people's lives are saved.
Well, since you opened the discussion, because I think that we should honor the tragedy to take place, and I don't think that it's the appropriate time to have a discussion about gun control, but far more people who have guns kill themselves, kill their friends and family. And to me, it's the idea that professionals with guns act in a way that protect us.
Oh, absolutely.
But
and legal gun owners, I'm sorry, Juan, legal gun owners are professional.
No,
they are.
not.
They can, you're smearing people who own guns right now.
I'm not smearing anybody.
You're saying that they can't handle a gun.
I'm saying
every gun owner I know trains and goes to the range.
Okay, in this case, what we have here is someone who had a permit from the state of Illinois.
Shouldn't have had it.
Oh, well, that's my point.
No,
you
that wasn't
you said every gun owner is trained and a professional.
No, that wasn't your point.
This guy is.
You said only professionals should have guns.
Yes, I think
that's wrong.
Police. But here's my point. You have a situation where this guy is given a gun permit, and I think if you looked into his background, if that witness had shown up in the domestic abuse case, he wouldn't have been able to get it. But he gets it, and then he perpetrates this horror. And by the way, we were talking about the partisanship, and he had this list. Now there's several Democratic candidates who have said that they are not running because they have had threats against their lives and that they're scared. They live in fear. You talk about not getting good people into public life.
Who's threatening them, though? Other Democrats? Or could it be Hillary versus Bernie?
Let's not get into it, but I'm saying they're deranged. There are a lot of deranged people who take any opportunity, any cause. They've aligned themselves with something, and then all of a sudden, we, having a political discussion, want to attribute blame to one side or the other.
Okay, but today we also got an update on House Majority Whip Steve Scalise, and he's on everybody's mind. And doctors say that he is still in critical condition, but miraculously, somehow, they think he will make an excellent recovery, even though he arrived at the hospital Wednesday at imminent risk of death. President Trump said these touching words about the congressman earlier.
My dear friend, Steve Scalise took a bullet for all of us. And because of him and the tremendous pain and suffering he's now enduring, and he's having a hard time, far worse than anybody thought, our country will perhaps become closer, more unified, so important. So we all owe Steve a big, big thank you.
All right, so Dana, that was very nice commentary, and this is someone who was very good to President Trump and candidate Trump when he was running for office.
Well, I'd like
a public statement.
Yeah, and I think that President Trump actually would have been like this with any member of Congress, whether they had supported him or not. I like
agree.
to believe that. I also feel like this is the week where he found out what it's like to be the comforter-in-chief for a nation. It won't be the first time that he has to play that role. Unfortunately, he knows that there will be other times to come, but I think he set a really good example and a high bar for himself today.
Excellent. Jesse?
There is a New Jersey Democratic political strategist named Devine who actually said this. He said he has little sympathy for Scalise because of his lack of support for gun control. Also tweeted, "We are in a war with selfish, foolish, and narcissistic rich people. Why is it a shock when things turn violent? Hashtag hunt Republican congressman." 48 hours after the shooting, the guy's hashtagging
Disgusting.
hunt Republican congressman. I can't even believe it.
He'll probably get hunted on
He
Twitter.
cannot be hired again.
That's awful.
I mean, ever again. Awful, right? I mean, it's unbelievable. All right, you have a final comment?
Well, I think that one of the stories that isn't brought up enough is medical expertise. The reductions in homicides are directly related to new, improved surgery, new, improved techniques. If you had the same medical technology as you did in the 70s, we always talk about our declining homicide rate. One of the reasons is because we're saving people.
Like casualties in war.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where they learned it, I think, is the battlefield is where they learned it. Yep. So, I mean, we don't want to get deceived by the fact that, well, some cities, the homicide rate's still going up and other ways it's going down. But a lot of it is the reductions are because we're just better at saving lives. It's interesting.
All right. And protecting lives as well. President Trump's fired up his opponents again.
President Trump hitting back hard today on the Russia investigation with this new tweet. "I am being investigated for firing the FBI director by the man who told me to fire the FBI director. Witch hunt." He's apparently referring to Deputy AG Rod Rosenstein, who recommended the president fire FBI Director James Comey. Rosenstein appointed special counsel Robert Mueller to head up the Russia investigation, which is looking at Mr. Trump for obstruction of justice if an anonymously sourced Washington Post story is to be believed. Mike Huckabee says a lot of these leakers are lying to try to take down the president.
That's what we have to start questioning. Who are these sources? Look, people close to Donald Trump, if they're talking, they don't belong in the circle of trust. The truth is, that's not who's talking. These are people who are making this stuff up to make Donald Trump look bad, because I'm convinced there is an attempt to overthrow, and I use that word purposely, overthrow this president, and that is anarchy.
So you're hearing a lot of this now in the press about maybe suspicions that Comey had this conversation with the president, and he then leaked this memo in order to spark a special counsel investigation of the president. And people are suspicious of that, and they're saying maybe people are trying to take this president down from within.
Well, first of all, like Rosenstein, is that his name? Okay, so he's in charge because his boss, Jeff Sessions, had to recuse himself.
Right.
And there's a possibility that Rosenstein will recuse himself, which leaves you with Rachel Brand. And if she recuses herself, it's the guy in the Trivago ad. But, you know,
I like him.
He's, you know, he's dressing better.
Fair.
Seems credible, yeah.
Donald Trump is in a video game right now called Get Trump. And he started the game, he put the coin in, I'm old school, on inauguration. And for the next 4 years, he is navigating through different levels of attacks, oncoming monsters, different kinds of weapons. When one weapon fails, like collusion, then there's another weapon called obstruction. What weapon's going to be next after that? So he is actually trying to get through and play the game for 4 years, right? And do his job. But he's got to get through all this. It's like playing Doom. If you remember, that was my favorite video game. But it is. It's Get Trump. Someone should do it.
So you were in the White House, and you know people that were in the White House when there was that special counsel investigation going on with the Scooter Liberty deal. The level of anxiety right now Where would you put that in the Trump White House?
Well, based on my experience, so I was Karl Rove's spokesperson during that whole time, and he writes very eloquently about what that was like, both in his book and then in his column in the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday. Then today you have a column by Mark Penn, who worked for Bill Clinton, and he writes in The Hill about what it was like for them with the special counsel, and both of them saying, if there is no evidence of the underlying crime, then the investigation should end.
Right.
Because everybody was caught up in these things, these sort of ancillary things. But that said, I think that Jamie Gorelick, who is Jared Kushner's lawyer,
right,
had the best response of anybody. And actually, the White House should just refer everything to her, because she said, yeah, duh, no doubt, there's an investigation. Of course, we expected this. By Governor Huckabee suggesting that there's more nefarious things happening, and I actually think that that's causing more problems, because then people are like, well, who could that be? And they're putting fuel on the fire when actually Jamie Gorelick is your best role model on this. She's like, yes, there's an investigation. We totally expected this. Nothing to see here. We're not worried about it. And if you look at what the president did today, you both talked about Congressman Scalise, but the Cuba policy, which we're about to talk about on this show, this is a big accomplishment, a campaign promise fulfilled. They focused on that, and I think if he had just not tweeted that thing about the witch hunt, he probably would have had that fully in the can today.
That's not a bad point. Juan,
Thanks.
we're talking about the... You're welcome, Tucker. I mean, Dana. We're talking about the hysteria on the one side, but then when you look at three, I think probably the top legal minds besides Kimberly Guilfoyle in the country, Ken Starr, Alan Dershowitz, and Jonathan Turley, constitutional scholars, they all say there's no obstruction of justice case here. Who do you believe, the Washington Post or these three people?
Oh, no. I mean, people who've done other obstruction of justice cases, including the one against Clinton, say that there is more than prima facie evidence here
Who said that?
for an obstruction of justice case.
Who said
I thought Ken Starr was the prosecutor.
No. There are other people who participated in these efforts. And so it's a matter of, which chef you want to call into the kitchen. But, I mean, I don't know how it plays out there. I mean, to me, the big news today is you have, staff told to preserve records.
That's very
You have the president's lawyer, Michael Cohen, saying he's hiring his own lawyer. We know that Vice President Pence has hired his own lawyer. They're now going to apparently interview people one of the lead communications people for the campaign. So, and we know that it goes beyond. I mean, one of the things about the Trump tweet that was so interesting was he suggests, as Greg was saying, well, maybe now it's not about collusion, now it's about obstruction. But in fact, the investigation goes on. It's not only collusion, it's also potentially obstruction, and now there's this financial piece that involves Jared Kushner. So we have it on many levels. But I think the most intriguing thing that happened now is this Rod Rosenstein putting out a very strange announcement that said, don't believe any anonymous sources that come from foreign governments. And you're thinking, well, is he talking about the news that already came out, or is something more coming that apparently is being intentionally sourced and placed by foreign governments trying to hurt the United States? This is really like getting deep.
Kimberly?
It's really not. I think it's superficial and it's bordering on asinine, because there is no evidence to support this. There wasn't last week or the week before. There still isn't now. All of these people, just so you know, I can tell you for a fact, already had attorneys. This is no new development. Michael Cohen, Jamie Gorelick has been representing Jared. She has the strong favor of the president in terms of he trusts her and respects her, and that's somebody that worked with the Obama administration. The bottom line is, it's smart to have a lawyer. Don't you all have lawyers that represent you? And
I
if
think
you
I need one.
You need one for other reasons, including restraining orders.
I need a whole group of lawyers.
The thing is, you would be ridiculous if you didn't have, given what's going on in the climate. But if you remember, we went down this road before, because it was the New York Times had 5 sources before when they said it was collusion with the president, right? Anonymous sources. And now, again, mysteriously, it's always the number 5 anonymous sources. So when you see Rosenstein saying, okay, hey, this is don't believe, anonymous source. Yeah, don't sink your teeth into stories that over and over again say anonymous sources. Where is it? I heard a man testify, the former FBI director, Comey, say that he didn't think that the president was trying to obstruct, that he specifically told the president he wasn't under investigation 3 separate times for collusion. So where exactly is the story here?
I think that
the story is that people are trying to undermine the presidency of the United States.
I think Comey said pretty clearly he took it as a direction. And so
where was that in the transcript?
He also said it was an obstruction.
But I think the most interesting thing before we run, Jesse, is that there's so much talk this weekend about whether Trump will in fact fire Mueller. That to me is, I think it's a crazy idea, but apparently not ruled out at this juncture.
Well, he does like to fire people. Directly ahead, President Trump turns up the heat at a rally in Miami, calling on Cuba to return a fugitive cop killer to the U.S. Detailed
On the road today, holding a rollicking rally in Miami, where he dramatically demanded that Cuba return a brutal cop killer to the United States. This woman, Joanne Chesimard, also known as Assata Shakur, shot and killed a New Jersey state trooper back in 1973. Instead of spending the rest of her life in jail, she's been living the good life in Cuba for over 30 years after escaping from a New Jersey prison with the help of her pals in the Black Liberation Army. President Obama made a big splash when he reopened diplomatic relations with the communist island in 2015, but he made no mention of Ms. Chesimard when touting his Cuba initiative, outraging New Jersey state troopers of all stripes. President Trump is taking a much stronger line with the country, demanding the communists send back Ms. Chesimard.
I say, put an end to the abuse of dissidents. Release the political prisoners. Return the fugitives from American justice, including the return of the cop killer, Joanne Chesimard. The harboring of criminals and fugitives will end. You have no choice. It will end.
So if you have been watching The Five for several years, that's not the first time you've heard of Ms. Chesimard. And Greg, you actually brought this to our attention back in 2013.
We've talked about her 4 or 5 times. Chris Christie brought it up once, and we've been covering it. She killed a New Jersey state trooper named Werner Forster, and she's been free ever since. Trump was right to kill this deal, because it is a deal, because we got nothing in this deal. Obama didn't even ask for Chesimard or Morales, the bomb maker. So what Trump is doing is says, that deal's done. We want these pieces back. We want a better deal. It might not even be, we might not be equal in the deal, but we're going to get these people back. And I want, maybe this is controversial. I don't care anymore. You can make a direct link from Chesimard to the Alexandria shooting, because there's a love affair with left-wing radical violence, which began in the late 1960s, and you saw it, whether it's the Weather Underground, the Black Panthers, even before that. Angela Davis, who supplied guns that killed a judge. You have Chesimard, who killed a cop. Chesimard was never retrieved, because to some, she was a romantic hero. When you're a radical leftist, you can kill. You can kill.
Actually, it's interesting because I watched that show, Madam Secretary, and not too long ago they had an episode of the reopening with Cuba, and they have this Chesimard type character, but actually in the show, she actually didn't commit the crime.
Right,
and
of course.
they convinced her to come back, and she comes back to a hero's welcome, which
Yes.
isn't actually adequate. Kimberly, the president also
Don't you hate creative license?
The president also talked very passionately about the human rights conditions, and basically saying that since President Obama made that deal, the conditions had actually worsened in the country.
Yes, well, again, this is another example of a bad deal, just like the Iran deal. Why not, use the power and the might of the United States to effectuate good throughout the world? For example, bad shame on you, do not harbor fugitives and people who execute police officers. And why don't you get something in return for once, to do something and do the right thing? Why do we always have to bend over backwards and play by their rules and on their terms when we actually have power and influence and leverage to actually accomplish some greater good? This was the easiest thing in the world for President Obama to ask for at the time. Instead, he gave them everything. We get nothing back in return. I think what President Trump did, makes a lot of sense. And again, it was something that he honored. And obviously, Marco Rubio has been pressing on this issue for quite some time. And you could tell that he was delighted. On
And yet,
Twitter.
Juan, the policy was not completely rolled back. The Obama era, but basically, the wet foot, dry foot policy is not changed. The embassies remain open. What does change, you can travel, but you can't go under this guise of a cultural trip anymore. It has to be actual travel. You're still allowed to send money to family if you are there. But the one thing it would change is that Americans doing business there, you would actually have to pay the business, not the military. And I think that's one of the biggest things that President Trump did today.
Good.
Right. So, the argument that comes from the left on this is, you know what? He didn't change that much. The embassies will still be open, as you just said. The carve-out is there in terms of trade. And you keep going. They're also allowed to use U.S. dollars.
Reasonable.
The reason that it's not reasonable is that what you get is we've had a failed policy that has allowed a communist state to remain in place at our doorstep for 50-plus years. And President Obama was making an effort to try to change this dynamic, and part of it was taking American democratic values into Cuba and encouraging our economic interest, because I think it would demonstrate to the Cuban government and the Cuban people in specific the virtues of capitalism.
Okay.
What we're doing now is pulling back. And, you know, Ben Rhodes, who was the leader in terms of the Obama effort, said today, he said, Trump doesn't care about human rights in Cuba.
This is the guy who made the deal with Iran.
Trump is making a political play here, and somehow you get some of the old-line Cuban Americans, not the younger ones, who want to see change, buying into this. But this is a total political.
why
You
would
can't
it
quote
pres-
Rhodes. Rhodes is a fraud.
Oh, yeah, I'll quote Jeff Flake, who said, you know what, he's talking about having a vote, a Republican senator, to just lift this whole embargo. Stop it.
Okay.
But, Jesse, one of the things that President Obama didn't do was to try to separate out the payment action, the payment issue. The payment, actually, if you go there, you're actually paying the Cuban military, which was perpetuating a lot of the humanitarian issues.
Right, so...
Follow the money.
Yeah, so now we don't have to pay the military, and that's good. So if you go over there, you pay the people, because the people are not doing too well over there in Cuba. I mean, it's just shocking we have a communist nation just south of our shores like that that's jailing and torturing dissidents and trafficking with North Korea.
And harboring fugitives.
And harboring fugitives in Venezuela. And I honor President Obama's desire to change the dynamic in that relationship and open up that country, but he did it in the wrong way. You don't reward a dictator and go over there and do the wave at a baseball game and then send all that dough over there, and it goes directly to the military, and then let these cop killers stay. This deal had no teeth. President Trump came in there and said, we're going to rip this deal up, and we're willing to go back to the negotiating table, and I think that's a win for America.
We got to run, or else we won't have time for Facebook Friday.
And also her failure to act, where she had a self-created duty to Mr. Roy, since she had put him into that toxic environment, constituted each and all wanton and reckless conduct. This court now finds you guilty.
That was a Massachusetts judge today convicting 20-year-old Michelle Carter of involuntary manslaughter, a major surprise to most legal observers. Miss Carter, back in 2014, sent a barrage of texts to her teenage boyfriend telling him to kill himself. Conrad Roy III soon thereafter committed suicide. Miss Carter now faces up to 20 years in jail when she's sentenced on August 3rd. Now, just to draw the picture for you, he was in a car and he's texting with her, and the gases are collecting in the car, and she tells him to get back in the car where he dies. Now, Massachusetts doesn't have a law against encouraging suicide, but you've got a situation where she says she cared for him. He was terribly depressed, and I don't want to have him live this way anymore. Kimberly, what do you say?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's very clear that she had a direct role that was essentially a proximate cause of his death, and she tried to take a chance by saying, okay, I'm going to go with the judge. She thought she'd fare better than going in front of a jury trial. Wrong. She has sociopathic tendencies, very clearly. This person is a danger to others. That's been demonstrated. There are over 1,000 Facebook and text messages between them to substantiate and document this. All she had to do was, like, let a family member know. Instead, I mean, she might as well have put a gun to his head. I think that she even acted even further than involuntary manslaughter. I feel that she acted with implied malice, which is acting in conscious disregard of a known risk. This man was suicidal, he was depressed, that is likely to result in great bodily injury or death. And she kept telling him, get back in the car to kill himself. So feel a little bit better when she's behind bars.
So, Jesse, you have the ACLU now saying, wait a second, if you do put in a law like that, it would impede end-of-life discussions among family members, your doctor. What do you say?
I don't know. It's a tough call. I mean, if